Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Hey, I see that Mike and Kim have already said hi, which is interesting because my view meter says that nobody's watching right now, so I know that it's wrong. That happens sometimes. It's usually right. It's good. It's a good website that I use. Anyway, yeah, please say hi. Let us know where you're watching from if you're willing to do that. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Elisha and Jezebel. I've been promising this for a while. Tonight, we're actually going to do it. We're going to finish up with the Ahab and Jezebel cycle. We're doing a survey of the Bible 1 week at a time. Each week, we're hearing a retelling of a critical Bible story that I think everybody needs to know. I strongly suggest that you read it ahead of time if you can. So you can email me at the email that is listed on your screen there, and you'll be put on the mailing list so that you get the paraphrasing in advance. That also, I send it out on Tuesday afternoons, so that also reminds people, hey, tonight we're having Bible study. Also, you can use that address to send me any questions you might have, either about last week's class or this week's class or whatever, or even things that you would like me to look at in the future. You can send those to me if you would like. And if you fall behind, it's easiest to find previous classes on YouTube, but you can find them on Facebook as well. Hey, Roseanne is here. Hey, the Vargos are here. Well, good to have you here, Vargos and Mom Jean. And Cindy Brown is here as well. Let me see if my view counter, my view counter is working now. Very good. All right. So I don't say this very often, but please hit like or subscribe, depending on which platform. That like the video, subscribe to the channel, and that helps more people discover what we're doing here. And I think it is good for us to have new people join our class from afar when possible. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So tonight, hey, Barbara Hamilton's here. Good to have you here as well. Tonight, we're summarizing quite a bit of material. I'm doing 2 Kings chapter 3, chapter 8, and chapter 9, and there's a bunch of stuff. Hey, John Ewan's here. Good evening. Bunch of stuff we're skipping over here, a couple of battles, and I'm summarizing quite a bit with what I do. I think we've got the gist of the events, though, so let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So King Ahaziah died without a male heir, so his brother Joram became king of Israel, the northern kingdom. He reigned for 12 years. He wasn't as bad as his parents, but he was bad. Israel continued to worship the Baals under his reign. In the 12th year of Joram's reign, Ahaziah became king of Judah. The two men were brothers-in-law, and Ahaziah was just as bad as Joram. The two of them joined forces and went to war against the Arameans. Joram was wounded, and the two kings went to Jezreel so Joram could recover. While Joram was laid up, Elisha sent one of his prophets on a mission. The prophet went to Ramoth Gilead, where he found Jehu, who was one of the commanders in Israel's army. And the prophet asked to speak with Jehu alone, and then poured oil on his head. He said, "The Lord says, I am making you king of Israel. You must kill every male in Ahab's line to punish them for killing my servants. Jezebel must die too. She will be eaten by dogs, and there won't be enough of her left to bury." Then the prophet ran away. One of Jehu's officers asked, "What did that religious nut want?" And Jehu said, "You know how those guys talk." "No, actually, I don't," he said. "Tell me what he said." "He said he had a message from the Lord and that I had been chosen to be the next king." Well, much to his surprise, Jehu's men immediately laid their cloaks on the ground in front of him. The trumpets blew as they shouted, "Jehu is king." Jehu and his men rode to Jezreel to assassinate Joram. As Jehu approached, he was seen from a distance. Joram was concerned. So he sent several messengers to ask if he came in peace, but each messenger he sent fell in line with Jehu's men and didn't come back. The lookout told Joram, "The leader drives his chariot like a madman. Only Jehu drives like that." So the two kings, Joram and Ahaziah, mounted their chariots and rode out to meet Jehu. Joram asked Jehu if he came in peace, and Jehu answered, There can be no peace as long as your mother keeps leading the nation into idolatry. Joram shouted to Ahaziah, "Run, it's a trap." But as Joram turned his chariot, Jehu shot him in the back with an arrow, killing him. They shot at Ahaziah too, and they wounded him, but he didn't die immediately. He made it all the way to Megiddo before he died. His men took his body to Jerusalem and buried him there. Jehu had Joram's body thrown onto the field where Naboth's vineyard had been. Naboth and his family had been murdered by Joram's mother Jezebel. Jehu had been there and remembered what God had said about it, so he felt that this was poetic justice. Jezebel was in Jezreel when all this played out. She put on her makeup and her crown, and she stood in the window of the palace. When Jehu rode in, she shouted to him, "What do you want, Kingslayer?" And Jehu shouted back, but not to her. He said, "If anyone up there is on my side, throw her down to me." The eunuch serving Jezebel immediately pushed her out of the window. She landed on the pavement as the army entered the city, and the horses trampled her. Blood was everywhere. Jehu went inside and had a meal. Afterward, he said, "I suppose we should bury her. She was royalty after all." But when they went to get her, they found that she had been eaten by dogs. All that was left was her hands, her feet, and her skull. When they told Jehu, he said, "That's what the Lord said would happen, that her corpse would fertilize the fields, and there would be no tomb for people to visit." This is the word of the Lord. So Sandy says, hello. Hello. What is that little, happy Halloween emoji. Hey. And Barbara is here, Barbara Ewald, and she's sorry to be late. Don't you worry about that at all. We're just glad to have you. After it posts and process, you can go back and catch the beginning if you missed anything. So reflections. I thought tonight, instead of talking about the typical three questions we usually ask, which are the three important theological questions. Hello, Stella. We would the theological questions that we normally ask are: what does the story tell us about God? What does this story tell us about ourselves? And what does this story tell us about our relationship with God and our relationships with each other? Those are the classic theological questions. They're in the disciple Bible study classes. They're what we use in seminary. But tonight I thought I'd talk a little bit about karma, or at least the way we use the word karma, not the way it's used properly in Indian religions like Hinduism and in Buddhism, but the way we use the word in America today, which is the idea that people kind of get what they deserve. It's the idea that good deeds lead to good outcomes, and that bad deeds lead to bad outcomes. And karma says that sooner or later people are going to get what they deserve. It kind of functions like a law of nature. So you may have heard about deism. Deism was a religious movement that was very popular, at least among educated classes during the 18th century. Many, but not all, of the founding fathers were deists. George Washington was not a deist. Thomas Jefferson was. Deism had a similar idea. Deists believed that God, they believed in God, and they believed that God had created the world, but they did not believe that God was active in the world the way we normally think about it in Christianity. They didn't believe in the supernatural exactly. They believed that, well, for example, Thomas Jefferson put together his own version of the New Testament that basically just cut out all of the miracles. So they believe that God created the world and that the world kind of runs like a clock. God is the great clockmaker or the great architect. You see that image in Freemason imagery. Many of them were also Freemasons. It was influential in Freemasonry at the time. So they believe that God created the world, and the world runs like a clock, a very complicated clock, but that it runs basically by itself. So he set it up, wound it up, let it go. So after having created the world, they didn't believe that God was involved in running the world. He just sat back and watched it operate the way he built it to operate. So they didn't believe in divine intervention. So um, they talked a lot about, you may remember from the founding fathers documents, talk about the laws of nature and nature's God. So they believe that when God created the universe, that he created the laws of science, like the laws of physics, but also the natural law. And they believed that natural law governed all of creation. They believed that history had a direction to it. They didn't, their understanding was not exactly fate and it was not exactly karma, but it wasn't entirely different from those concepts either. So they believed that the world operates the way God intended for it to operate, and it operated according to this set of laws, and that the goal of writing human laws then should be to reinforce these laws of nature. So there was a creative order, they believed, and that this created order rewarded certain behaviors while punishing other behaviors. They didn't believe that it was perfect, but they did think it was real, and that human laws should reinforce natural law rather than working against natural law. So for them, when people got what they deserved, it wasn't because God had intervened to punish them. It was because God had designed the system to work that way. I hope I said all that in a way that makes sense. So their understanding of karma was that God created the world to function a certain way, and that way was would effectively make sure that people sooner or later got what they deserved, and that human laws should reinforce that system. So once again, if people got what they deserved in this life, it was not because God had intervened to punish them or to reward them. It was that God had just designed the world to work that way. Now, of course, both things can be true in reality, right? There can be a natural order that is governed by a God who set it up that way. And it can also be that God sometimes intervenes in that natural order to change things. Both things can happen. And in fact, in the Bible, both things do happen. So, for example, how does this apply to today's lesson? So, this story, prophets like Elijah, like Elisha, very often deliver a message that basically says, look, king, or look, people of the nation, you're doing the wrong thing. You need to stop doing that. If you don't stop doing the wrong thing, there are going to be consequences. And they might say what those consequences are going to be. They might not say what those consequences are going to be, depending on what God has put on their hearts. So these consequences then sometimes play out in ways that strongly imply, if they don't require, that God did something miraculous to intervene to stop the people from doing what they were doing or to punish them from doing what they were doing. And other times, though, it looks more like the consequences that came from the people doing the wrong thing were the natural result of what happens if you keep doing the wrong thing over and over again for a long period of time. And that this is just the natural consequences, and God's trying to warn the people that, hey, I set up the world to work a certain way, and you're violating that, and if you keep going, you're gonna hurt yourselves. Okay, so both of those things, I would argue, are playing out with Ahab's family, because Ahab's family was warned both under Elijah and under Elisha that you need to cut it out, you need to stop leading the people, you need to stop worshiping the Baals yourself, you need to stop encouraging other people to worship that pantheon of gods under Baal. If you don't, there's going to be consequences. So the things that happen to Ahab's family today, the main intervention in the story, the main divine intervention, is when God tells Jehu that Jehu is going to be God's agent, that God wants Jehu to be the next king, and that he needs to go and take Joram out of the picture. Okay? So that's the intervention here. What about the other things that take place? The things that happen to Ahab's family, you could argue the things that happened to him at the hands of his own people are actually the direct result of Ahab's previous actions and Joram's previous actions. So after God tells Jehu to go fight Joram, God does not make Joram's own men turn on him, but his men do turn on him. The minute Jehu says, this crazy prophet, and they did talk about the prophets being crazy. The minute Jehu says, this crazy prophet thinks I'm supposed to be the next king, the people around him all go, that's a great idea. We'd love to have you be the next king. Let's go end this king. They were primed. They were already ready to do that. Ahab's dynasty was not popular, right? So God doesn't make Ahab's Joram, the son is Joram, or Jehoram, depending on where you read it. God didn't make Jehoram's men turn on him, but they did. God does not make those messengers that he sends out join into the rebellion. God does not make the horses trample over Jezebel's body. Or does God make those horses trample over Jezebel's body? You could argue it either way, right? So either way, God warned them, they ignored the warning, and there were consequences. Whether the consequences were divine intervention or just things working themselves out doesn't ultimately matter, because even when things just sort of work themselves out, they're following the natural law that God created. I'm not saying the deists were right. They had a very limited and admittedly they were trying to have a limited understanding. They were trying to, I guess, demythologize Jesus and the God of Israel, which I would say is a bad thing. But so they were right about what they believed. They were just wrong about what they didn't believe. So that's all I have to say about Jezebel. Very grim end that she met there. Good evening, Barry. Good to have you here. So I want to talk just for a few minutes about the state of the nation, so to speak. We are 1 week away from Judgment Day. Please don't take that literally. I don't want to be one of those crazy preachers on the internet. We're 1 week away from Election Day, just a couple days away from Halloween, which is going to be so much more fun. And the big thing in the news this week, at least in my feed, is that Jeff Bezos decided that the Washington Post would not be endorsing a presidential candidate, not just this year, but they're not going to do it anymore. And this is not the first time this has happened. There was a previous era in the early 20th century when they decided to stop doing that as well. Bezos wrote an article about it to defend himself after people were extremely upset. He said that it's the Post's job to help people make informed decisions, not to tell people who to vote for or how to vote. One of his top editors resigned over this. As of right now, 200,000 people have dropped their subscription to the Washington Post. People are saying that Bezos did this in order to help Trump. People are saying that, that's what they're saying. And many of the people who are saying this are, some of my colleagues in ministry. Many of my colleagues in ministry have gone on Facebook over the past few days to say that they are dropping their subscription to the Washington Post. Most of them are, third or fourth generation Post subscribers, have been reading it all their lives, and they're not going to read it anymore. And that saddens me. Not because I'm a big fan of the Washington Post. I'm certainly not. I don't read it anymore. I don't read any of the main newspapers anymore. Well, that's not true. I read bits and pieces of all of them. I don't sit and read any of them as an entity. I'm thinking about how back at annual conference back in May, one of the people who spoke to us was the president of Wesley Theological Seminary, which is David McAllister Wilson. Great man, brilliant man, great academic, great man of faith. And he said two things in his speech. The first was that he said the United Methodist Church is and has always been a progressive evangelical church, which is always going to put us outside of the mainstream, both politically and theologically. The other thing he said was, which goes along with it, is that the church can never be either. These were his words. He says, "We cannot be the chaplains of the right nor the cheerleaders of the left. We must maintain an independent voice." And everybody cheered this. Everybody, as well they should. Everybody said that's exactly right. The thing is, though, that some of the people who cheered him saying that we need to have an independent voice and that we can't be either the chaplains of the right or the cheerleaders of the left are now saying they're going to drop their subscription to their newspaper because the newspaper didn't back the candidate they wanted. And with all due respect to my colleagues, I find that to be inconsistent with what we said back in May. Now, having said that, I'm going to be honest, I'm kind of ambivalent about this whole thing because, I read what Bezos wrote, and it sounds great. In a perfect world, newspapers wouldn't have an editorial bias and they wouldn't endorse candidates. They would just be trying to give us an unbiased, true accounting of the facts that we could then use to weigh the pros and cons of both candidates and their policies and characters and everything. In a perfect world, they would actually do what Bezos says he wants to do with the Post, which is to help people make informed decisions, not tell them how to vote. The thing is, though, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where almost all newspapers do have an editorial bias. You can go to allsides.com. If you've never been to allsides.com, I highly recommend that website. It shows you how different news outlets of different it shows you how different news agencies are covering the same topics, how they're refusing to cover certain topics, and they list what the bias of each outlet is, and you'll see if you look at it that most news outlets have a bias. There are very few that are in the center, but most of them claim to be delivering the unvarnished truth. Well, from where I'm sitting, presidential campaign endorsements by newspapers are the closest these newspapers ever come to admitting what their editorial bias is. And given the fact that they have an editorial bias, I kind of like it when they sort of pull the curtain back at election season and say, oh, by the way, this is the candidate that we've been supporting in all of our news articles for the past year. I kind of like them to do that. I wish they didn't have a bias, but if they're going to have a bias, they should at least be open about what it is. I mean, the Washington Post leans left. It has always leaned left. It still leans left. Everybody knows that. You can go on all sides and you can say that it leans left of center. It doesn't lean far left, but it leans left. They have center, left, far left, right, far right. Under the Trump administration, when Trump was president, the Post went after him hard. They adopted the motto, democracy dies in darkness. And most people thought that that was a direct reference to Trump's rhetoric toward the mainstream media at the time. The Post still has an editorial agenda. Bezos probably has an agenda too, but I don't pretend to know what that agenda is. I mean, he says his agenda is he wants to move the Post toward the center. Well, a lot of people are saying that Bezos is just trying to make money or he's just trying to help Trump. He's never tried to help Trump before. Bezos' agenda cannot just be to make money, because if all he was concerned about was making money, he would never have bought a newspaper. I mean, if you want to make money, buying a newspaper is like the exact opposite of what you should do. And he certainly wouldn't have done something like this because, I mean, he had to have known that this would have cost him subscribers, right? I mean, he had to have known that. So whatever his agenda is, it's not just to make money. The thing is, though, unless he makes real changes to move the Post toward the center, which would be awesome, this is kind of disingenuous. Maybe not intentionally so, but the fact that they're not coming out and saying we want you to vote for one candidate or the other, doesn't mean that their reporting isn't encouraging you to do that. Anyway, he says he's going to change that. He's going to move them toward the center, which I'm sure they won't be happy about. Well, we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Bottom line is the election is upon us next week. Please vote. It is not just your civic duty to vote; it is your Christian duty to vote in a democracy, whether it's a direct democracy or a representative democracy like ours. The people are we are morally accountable for what our leaders do because we put those leaders there. So it is therefore our Christian duty to vote because God will hold us accountable for what the people we elect do ultimately. I understand that you may not like either of the candidates because I don't like either of the candidates. I'm voting for what I consider to be the lesser of two evils, and for legal reasons, I'm not going to tell you who that is, and I am certainly not endorsing anybody. Absolutely not. I honestly don't understand how anybody could be excited about either one of them, but this is what we got. So vote, but more importantly, folks, and I do think this is more important, pray that the election is orderly, that nobody does anything shady, at least not, I mean, people are already doing shady stuff, burning ballot boxes on the West Coast, but so far nothing big enough that would change the outcome of a contest. Pray that everything is orderly, that nobody does anything shady, and that everybody accepts the results, and that we have a peaceful transfer of power from Biden to whoever wins the election. I've told this story before. Some of you probably haven't heard it, though. Back when I was a Doctor of Ministry student at Wesley Theological Seminary, which is in D.C., of course, we had the opportunity to go to the Capitol building and to meet Admiral Black in person. Admiral Black was, I think he's still the chaplain of the United States Senate, the first, so far only chaplain to ever reach the rank of admiral in the Navy. Great man, brilliant man, PhD. And we had the opportunity to meet him. We had the opportunity to ask him questions. And I had a question. I said, many of us are going back to congregations where the people sitting in the pews no longer believe that their elected representatives and elected officials actually care about the best interests of the people who voted them into office. And what would you have us say to those people? And I expected him to say that, well, there are certainly, this is a guy who was on a first name basis with most of the Senate, right? I expected him to say, well, it's certainly true that some of them are like that, but most of them are just flawed people doing the best they can and just pray that they do better. That's not what he said. That was the message I wanted to take back to the people. I wanted to say, look, I met with the chaplain of the Senate, and he told me to tell you all that they're good people doing their best, but he didn't. He didn't say that. He just smiled, and he said, tell your people to pray for their elected officials. Tell them to pray for them with specificity, was the word he used. He said, because if you have them do that, I think that they will find that their elected leaders will provide them with many opportunities to increase the breadth and depth of their prayer lives. I don't want to put words in the man's mouth, but that was my take on that, was that he was saying that is exactly the truth of the people who are sitting in that chamber. Like I said, I want to put that in his mouth, but so we did this. We're the only ones who can fix it. We need a new set of people. We do. We just need a new set of people. And you know how I feel about political parties. But anyway, vote and pray for peace. Pray. That's all I have for you this week, folks. Barbara says, appreciate your personal reflections. Thank you, Barbara. I know that I know that following politics is a hobby of yours. And I'm sure my perspective is different from your friends. So I appreciate those sentiments. So next week, we're going to do a big time skip, and we're going to go to King Joash, one of the very few kings in the Bible that God considered to be a good king. So don't forget to email me any questions you've got. If you do send me, you're very welcome, Barbara. If you do send me a question, I will not, when I read it, I will not put your name on it unless you expressly tell me that that is okay. So, like I said, don't forget to like the video and share the video on your Facebook feed if you think other people in your friend group might be interested in joining us. Anyway, I will see you either in church or online. Until then, God bless, and let's close with a word of prayer, shall we? God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which must be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Amen.